everyone, my name is Sarah Dorr. I'm ISA's Director of Professional Development. Thank you so much for coming to Research Data Management 101, Data Management Essentials. Just a few things I wanted to point out before we get started. There is the chat feature in Zoom, so you can ask a question or comment there, or you can use the Q&A. And if anybody is having connectivity issues, the chat would be a great place to start, just to let us know if you can't hear us or some kind of technical issue. I am going to turn it over to Jennifer Chaput. Jennifer, do you want to wave so everybody knows it's you? And Renee Walsh, who are both STEM librarians at the University of Connecticut. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sarah. All right, and so it looks like we don't have a huge number of people. So one thing that would be really helpful, I'll introduce myself real quick. And then while I'm doing that, if you want to put in the chat what department or area your study or research is in, that would be really helpful just to help us get a sense of, who's here today and what disciplines you work in. Just so we can get a sense of who's here. So yeah, I'm Jennifer Chaput. I'm a STEM and research data management librarian at the University of Connecticut. I serve as a subject specialist to several STEM departments like chemistry and biomedical engineering and molecular and cell biology. And then I also share research data management duties with my co-host, Renee. So Renee, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Renee Walsh, and I'm also a STEM librarian. So Jennifer is a liaison to more like biomedical chemical engineering, and I'm a liaison to computer science, electrical engineering, physics, math, statistics, and one humanities area of French studies. So yes, that's it. Let's see let me take a look at the chats here.
Yeah, I was able to get the chat window up here too. Normally
we got national international security, cool. Someone from Canada, data scientist, George Mason. Wow, a nice variety of backgrounds here.
Yeah. So normally when we do this workshop, we focus on, like the true STEM disciplines. Yeah, like chemistry labs and engineering and stuff like that. And so I've tweaked it a little bit to kind of go a little bit more towards humanities and social sciences data. I see we have some folks who have a little bit more of a science background too. But so it's just nice to know what everybody studies, and so if we're talking or answering questions or have examples, that's really helpful to get a sense of what everyone looks at. Very interesting. Cool. So let's get started. And yeah, like Sarah said, please put your questions in the chat or the Q&A, and we can either answer them as we go along, or if you want to save questions till the end, that's fine too. So I'm going to just move this chat box out of the way. So today we're going to talk about, what data management is and why it's important. Talk about the way some of the research funders may have policies about data management and sharing and what you can do with your data. Talk about some best practices and documenting how to manage your data, and some tools for storing and sharing. So the first question I always like to start off with is, what is data management? And especially when you think about the humanities field, a lot of times people don't think the word data the same way, like I just mentioned. Think of science data and experiments rather than, the types of research, but things that, especially people in your fields might be doing, surveys and all kinds. I see, what was the other one here? I saw human migration data, like lots of really cool stuff. Things that you may not consider data necessarily, even, reading and writing papers, you've still got data that goes along with those projects. And so organizing, best practices for organizing is kind of the key of what we're talking about today. So as you're working with either yourself or with a team, kind of planning ahead to manage how you're going to organize and store the data, where it's going to be stored on your laptop or in the cloud or something like that. And then making sure it's safely preserved and accessible if you need to go back to it. Like I mentioned, there are federal or private funders that require different things of your research data, and then getting prepared to share your data either as part of your publication or with other researchers, and making sure that it's accessible to them. So kind of like I just touched on, thinking about what sorts of data might be coming out of these fields. Yeah, surveys and observational research. You might have text files, you might have spreadsheets, you might have interviews, and in addition to maybe transcripts of that, you might have some audio files, you might have videos, you know, some kind of MP4 or another type of video file. If you're doing text analysis, using some kind of a text analysis tool, you know, that'll be in some sort of output. Geospatial data files, you know, our human migration folks might have that. We do work with people in other areas of science too that do, you know, tracking of things, or radar or LiDAR focused on different environmental things. So lots of different types of data outputs that are out there. And then of course, your thesis or dissertation is also considered a research output. If you're doing something grant funded and publishing a paper based on your results or the data sets that go along with that, those also count as part of your research output. And so this is kind of it sort of mirrors the academic, you know, research life cycle. The data management life cycle is where you're starting to think of what your project is going to be, you know, propose either your research question or your hypothesis, and then start creating or collecting data along with that, doing some kind of analysis, and then hopefully getting it published, archiving that data off somewhere, and then potentially reusing it either to add on to another study or sharing it with somebody else to use. So this also is kind of helpful to think about as we're going through the process. And this is not necessarily locked in stone. You can go back from one step to another. It can be iterative and build on itself. So you may start collecting data and analyzing it, realize you don't have enough and need to go back and get more, things like that. So just a helpful diagram to get a sense of what's going on. So thinking about as you're doing research, hopefully you've gotten money from somewhere. It might be part of your academic program, but if you're going off and doing a fellowship or some other kind of funded research, there are different places that you might get that money from. And so it might be a private organization like the Gates Foundation, for example. In the US, we have a lot of federal funders that have research grants and scholarships and fellowships that are available. So the National Endowment for the Humanities, NSF, National Science Foundation, NIH, National Institutes of Health, IMLS, which is Institute for Museums and Libraries. They have a lot of different subcategories under that, but that's kind of the big funding heading. There might be other types of grants that are out there. Like I mentioned, fellowships, scholarships. Sarah shared with me some kinds of the places that people in ISA get funding from. And so there's a lot of different things that are out there. But it's important to note that they may have, you know, requirements about what you can and cannot do as part of your research project. You know, what they may want you to do with the data. If it's especially a federal public funder, they may be wanting you to share that data with somebody. We can talk about that really quickly. So for example, in the US, the NSF has a data sharing policy that they're expecting you to share your data publicly after your project has been finished. And we'll talk about how and where to do that later on. But the idea is that if it's publicly funded research, they want that information to be available to others out there as well. And they also require you to submit a data management plan, which can sound scary and technical, but it's really going to follow the things that we're talking about today, and talking about how you're going to be organizing your data, who's going to have access to it. You know, if you're working with human subjects or doing some kind of sensitive research, making sure that that's protected, and how you're planning to share it afterwards. That's included in that as well. NIH does fund, even though it's National Institutes of Health, there's a lot of different arms of that. And so some of the types of research that folks in ISA may do could potentially fall under NIH. They also have a data sharing policy, and I will make sure that Sarah gets a link to this slide set afterwards, so you all have the links to everything that's on here. Get more information about the data sharing policy and what applies. And they're also going to be, as of 2023, next January, they're going to be requiring that data management plan as well, that document. So that's a new change for them, but same kinds of things. And you can see here what they're looking for, very similar to what NSF asks for. What are the data types that you're producing, and how is it going to be preserved and shared? Who's allowed to do what with your data? Those kinds of things. And some of your funders may also require that you publish in an open access journal, which means that it's free for everybody to read, or that you make sure that the data is shared openly, subject to any restrictions. Again, if we're talking about those human subjects data, making sure that it's safely de-identified, and perhaps you can't share it and it needs to be available upon request. But this is a great tool that gives you information about this, who has what sort of open access policy, depending on the funder that you have. We'll just take a quick look at this. So let me just put in Gates Foundation again as an example. And you can see here that if you happen to get a grant from this foundation, that they require you to publish in a peer-reviewed open access journal, and they require you to openly archive your data. So lots of different funders are on here. A good way to find out what might be required of anybody that you're looking at getting funding from. Any questions about funders or anything else? Let's take a peek at the chat real quick. And again, if something comes to you as we're talking and you think of it later, feel free to put it in the chat and we'll get to it later on. All right. So kind of heading into the heart of what we're going to talk about today is managing your data, making sure that you're avoiding errors, that things are organized really well. Let's click back to that. If you have related data sets, in this case, if you've got a spreadsheet and a video interview and some other things, making sure that everything related to all pieces of your research, if you're doing human subjects research and maybe you're trying to connect an interview to some of the other pieces of the project, making sure that you can connect, all the stuff that is set up together. And then making sure that everybody is working together and understanding what it is that they're working on. For example, if we're conducting a survey and I think we're doing survey A and Renee thinks we're doing survey B, but we're actually both working on the same thing, we may end up duplicating things. You might end up having confusion and error. So making sure that everybody has everything, understood and named as you're setting up your research project. So these are the kinds of things that we're hoping to avoid by giving you some information about how to manage your research well. So heading into best practices. A couple of different aspects of what good data management might look like. So we'll talk about how to make a data inventory and how to describe that data, and then how to plan to preserve it and make sure it's accessible. And a little document called a README file that is a great way to describe your data, just as a quick overview for yourself when you're going back into stuff, or for somebody else that might be looking at it. So just an example here of how you might structure some of your files, a main folder for your project, a folder for your data, folder for emails and notes from minutes, stuff for your paper that you're working on. And a thing to note here is that you've got your raw data, all your initial input data, and then keep that separate and saved and ideally locked from editing, so that you have one copy that's safe, and then you work on a second copy when you're doing your analysis. So thinking about creating a data inventory, and going back to the beginning, thinking about what kinds of data are we collecting? What are we getting? And what sort of files are that? Are they spreadsheets? Are they the videos or audio documents that we talked about? Are they GIS file sets? Is it some kind of statistical analysis maybe that you're doing on something? And then thinking about that original form of data, is it stable like that, or does it need to be saved in another form? And how much data you're going to generate is going to also help you figure out how much computer storage you're going to need for this project. If you've got something that you're getting constant input on, constant responses, you're going to need a lot more data storage than you might for just a couple of survey spreadsheets. And then thinking about anything else that goes along with it. If you're doing some kind of analysis and coding out something, statistics or something to get information out of your data. If you've got survey templates, other things that go along with it, that's all part of your data package as well. So again, thinking about sort of how to organize is always a great thing to do at the beginning of your project. That one directory per project, like we saw in that example, making sure that original data is read-only, and then having a README document for each folder that explains what's in there, and keeping all of those different data components separated out so that things don't get mixed up or there's any problem with that. Use an example of a README template that shows some of the different options that might be on there. I know it's a lot of text on the screen, so we'll make sure you get these slides. But you can see a file name structure in the second here, the second part of the screen, you can see some file format examples of all the different types of files you might have. And we'll talk about this a little bit too, but if you've got a spreadsheet, any tabular data, explaining what all those column headings and things in there mean. Questions before we move on?
Sorry, I don't see any questions. I was muted.
Oh, no problem.
No questions right
Okay,
now.
great, thanks. Okay. So the next section, we're going to talk just about some tips and tricks and best practices for how to manage and organize your data as you're getting your project together. One big thing that is a simple thing that can actually make a very big difference is thinking about how you're going to be presenting and recording dates as you're doing your research. So if we look at the date on the screen here, we see a string of numbers. I'm going to guess this is a date that this survey was done. But you can see there are a couple of different options depending on maybe if you've done the American annotation or a European style annotation. It could be a lot of different things. And so that can be a little confusing. So you want to make sure everybody's on the same page, which format you're recording your date in and keeping it the same for everybody. So there's best practice is to do, as you can see here, a 4-digit year, a 2-digit month, and a 2-digit date. And that can either be all strung together or you can separate it with dashes. If you're doing something where you need to record the time that something was done, there's an example here. And so, you've got 2012 and then June 6th broken down. And then once everybody knows that this is how you're recording your dates, that helps. Another thing to think about is what we call extensibility. You can see in the left column, I'm sure you've probably seen this. I've seen this as you're sorting out files that maybe have numbers in them. It's going to try to sort your files numerically. So you can see it goes from example 1 and then example 10. And then 2, 3, 4, because it's sorting numerically and pulling in 1 and then 10. You can see in the right-hand column, everything sorts out nicely. If you're going to have a couple of hundred, for example, responses of something, putting those extra zeros in there. It sorts out nice. It's easy on your eyes. It's easy on the computer. Really helps to make everything readable. Renee.
So we do have a question from Priya that says, how to manage qualitative and quantitative research together?
That is a great question. Priya, do you have more examples? Are you thinking like, you know, spreadsheets and analysis, and then also maybe, you know, like text or other kinds of files?
Personally, I would recommend that if you have quantitative and qualitative research, that you keep them separate.
Yeah.
So if you have, you know, your tabular data, that is your that represents your quantitative research, you know, and then maybe you use some of that data to you use like some Python to analyze that. So you'd have all these folders that were that, and then, you know, qualitative data, maybe you're coding some text interviews. That would be kept separate. And Jennifer, I'm assuming you're going to talk about long-term preservation.
Yep, we've got some stuff about that afterwards.
We'll come back to that about how you can treat those different types of data for long-term preservation. But basically, I would recommend that you have a folder file system where you keep that data separate. So you would keep your raw quantitative data separate from your raw qualitative data. Priya, if you have any other questions, and if that answers your question, you can comment or ask another question. But I think we can probably move on now. I don't see anything else.
Yeah, I agree with Renee. I just flipped back to the screen. Thinking about the file structure. Yeah, like Renee mentioned, having, under your data file, you could have a folder just for, your quantitative and one for your qualitative, and then keeping, again, those files separated out.
And then we have a question from Kira, but the qualitative and quantitative data could still be linked in a relational database, right?
Yeah. But making sure that, you've got one copy that you're working with in your database, and then keeping that original raw data, separated out somewhere as read only. So, and then it's just working with copies of that. But yeah, absolutely. So there's kind of two ways to thinking about it. You're thinking about working it together, and then also thinking about making sure that all the individual files are, organized and stored, and so you can tell what's what. And that's where maybe that folder structure, like we mentioned, would come into play. Let's back here. Just quick thinking about file descriptions quickly. Being descriptive, and instead of just a really short thing, you can put your date in here. You can see we've got our date format and an example of what this is. Make it easy on yourself so that when you're looking back at something, you know what it is that you're looking at. And then being consistent, you can see an example here that has our extensibility with our numbers at the end. And then, so that's, easy on your eyes and easy on the machine to sort out and make it readable for both of you. File naming, again, just abbreviations. You don't have to really abbreviate anything. You're not going to remember what that acronym is that you made up. So using, an easily readable name for your file. And then you can see some example here. We've seen both the underscore and the dashes as we're putting a space into your file name. Most software now won't even let you put like an actual space in between words. Word will let you do it, but that's not the best practice. And I don't even do that. I use like an underscore now. And so just making sure that it's easy for you to read. And then if you're trying to import, for example, into another program and you've got a space in your file name, it can cause errors. So avoiding special characters, same thing, can cause problems with importing stuff into a coding software, and most software, again, won't let you put a special character into a file name anyway. It'll give you an error message. Renee, do you want to talk a little bit about proprietary and open data formats?
Yeah, sure. So it's totally fine if you are doing your research with proprietary data formats. Like say you're using a microscope that had a special file format. That's fine. It's just that when you move your data, your data has different steps in the process, right? You have your original raw data, which you keep separate. You make copies for the analysis part. And then when you're done with your research project, and especially if you're publishing or you're following mandates from the funder, you're going to want to store your data for long-term preservation in a research repository in an open format. And that's just because software in proprietary formats becomes obsolete. They can become unreadable in the future. Some proprietary formats degrade over time. And so you want to make a copy that you are putting into the repository that is in a long-term preservation format. So if you have tabular data, you want to convert that to a CSV for long-term preservation. You can convert into a TXT with your textual data. PDFs are fine for like just a static document. TIFF files, PNGs are fine for and then you have the little audio and video long-term formats. So that's one thing. Jennifer, do you want to go to the next slide?
Yeah, let's see. Oops. So yeah, as we're moving on, thinking again about, where your data is coming from, how you're collecting it, if you've got a survey instrument or what the other guidelines are for how, any measures that you're using to collect your data and what programs you're using, some other things to think about. So I mentioned briefly earlier those, variable names at the top of your spreadsheets. What do all those column headings mean? If you're measuring dates, times, anything like that, any unit of measure, and what to do if you don't have any data for a particular field, either it wasn't recorded or not applicable to that particular thing. Think about how to handle that in a spreadsheet or other processing as well. So a couple of examples of what we call a data dictionary. And you can think about this, especially maybe if, you've got others working with you or, student researchers that are going out in the field to do surveys, making sure that everybody's recording everything easily, hopefully correctly and in the same way so that you're not getting errors later on. So you can see here, we've got our variable or field name on the left-hand side. And is this going to be a text input? Or you can see there's a couple choices where we have radio buttons to click off what it is, what the label of that column is going to be. And then you can see in the far right column, some of them, we have choices for what the different things are going to be, either that radio button or a choice input that you're going to have. Excel allows you to set fields like this. So you can set a field to have a certain type of input or a range. And so that makes it a little bit easier if multiple people are working on something. You're making sure that everything is getting collected correctly. Here's another example. So you can see here for the study ID, we're expecting an 8-digit number to be in there. Our date format, in this case, we're collecting a weight. And so we're expecting that to be in pounds. And so if you start seeing numbers that are off of that, maybe somebody started entering that in kilograms. And so this also makes it easy for you to just kind of scan over and see if there are any errors in there, but also easy for everybody working on it. Make sure you're collecting everything the same way. It's within the value range. And it makes it easier later on too when you're importing this and trying to do some sort of analysis on it. This is a little bit of a blurry screenshot from a software for a scientific tool. But the idea here I wanted to share was that if you've got some sort of, database or input that you're expecting, or an example, doing a screenshot with all the options or settings that you might be expecting somebody to put in is a great idea. So that if anything changes, you've got a screenshot of what's there. Or if you have to go and reset it, you know what you did the original time. So if you're using any kind of special instrument or software or something like that, this is a great way to make sure you record that information. And then depending on what field you're working in, there may be particular, sort of standards or protocols, ways that people are expected to collect data. This kind of comes back to the data sharing that we talked about a little bit, but if everybody in a field is collecting or inputting data in the same way, that can help, and especially with analysis or sharing or exporting your data out, if people are putting everything in there. So, or there's a certain way that you do surveys or experiments in this field, what's expected. It kind of touches on what I just said, collecting and documenting your data, sharing your data together with other researchers if you're all using the same standard for recording your information. And there's a tool out there called fairsharing.org. It's a website where you can go in and search by the field that you're working in, and it'll break things down and let you see what some standards are. Renee.
We just have a comment in the
Sure.
Q&A from Priya that says, good analysis, thank you. I wish to know how to organize the variable which has multiple implications. Can you actually kind of explain or give an example of a variable with multiple implications that will allow us to better answer your question? Thank you, Priya. I'll wait and see. You can keep going on, Jennifer, and I'll see if there's a
and we can come back to that.
Yeah.
Standards was where we left off. And so that might be something helpful to look at too, if somebody doesn't share that with you that you're working with, but if you're starting a new project, to see if there are any standards for data collection or data sharing to make it available, as you're starting to plan your project. Let's see. So talking about data storage now, which is one of the big questions we always get from people at our institution. And so whatever school or institution you're working with, they may, of course, have their own policies and procedures for how to store data. They may be able to give you more information about, you have access to this drive, or you have access to a Dropbox or something. But we'll talk a bit about some storage best practices. So one thing that's important to think about is where the data is stored throughout your project. So like we talked about, with our little research cycle here, thinking about where things are stored and who needs to have access to them at those different points. So maybe as you're planning your study and doing your data collection, you're collaborating with somebody on Google Drive. Maybe your research stuff is just being stored locally onto your laptop. And then as you move through, maybe you've got your data set and you're loaded everything onto an external hard drive or a server for the department or program that you're working with. And then that data, once you've published it, is going off to a repository to be stored safely for the long term. But think about who has access to which different parts and where it's going to be stored, making sure it's appropriate for the phase of your project that you're in. So thinking about that data inventory that we had earlier, documenting where it's going to live throughout these different phases, and planning ahead so that you know where things are going to go. And like I mentioned, who has access to what. Of course, best practice is to have multiple copies. Try to geographically disperse them. We'll talk about that in a second. Just making sure any laptops, anything like that, are locked for folks who don't need access to them. If you've got sensitive data, making sure that it's even password protected once you get into the document itself, so that only people who need access to it can get in there. We'll talk about this, and then I see that in the chat that Priya has the ability to unmute if we want to talk about that. Let me get through this slide and we can come back to that. So I mentioned sort of geographically dispersing and having multiple copies. So having like 3 copies of your data is a reasonable amount without being overkill and having too many, ideally on 2 different types of storage media. So if you've got it on your laptop, either also make a copy off to an external drive or to a cloud, and then one of those copies off-site, like geographically in a different location from where you are. So, you know, in a Dropbox server or some other kind of server that maybe is stored somewhere else. That'll protect you from something local, like your laptop getting stolen, your data still in the cloud somewhere, or a lab fire or natural disaster or flood or something, you know, in the institution where you are. So Priya, if you want to follow up on your question, or we can come back to it later. I don't want to put pressure on you right now, but if you wanted to give more of an example of what you were asking about, looks like Sarah's unmuted you, so you have the option to unmute if you want to chat.
Yes, I'm audible now.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you so much for a very good comprehensive analysis. First question, I think you have somehow answered it. The second question I'm asking about, you know, there are variables which has multiple impact. Like if we take example in developing countries, like if we take example the variables of income, no, economic indicator.
Mm-hmm.
If one has a less income or very you can say the income which is just for the survival of human being,
Mm-hmm.
then there will be impact on health, education, even the freedom, the person which want to do something in multiple front, they can be impacted on that, and we can
Mm-hmm.
just observe in various research. So when we are doing research in a field of economic development or income, something like that, then it's very difficult to actually organize this multiple complex facts together.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I was asking in that context that question. Or you take example of poverty, or indicator of poverty, implication of poverty is also on multiple factors, on overall human development, on health, on education, or you take example of the like freedom or move ahead. No person cannot be moving ahead because they will be trapped into that poverty
Mm-hmm.
trap, and that is what I'm asking.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. And this is, oh, go ahead, Renee.
Yeah, I'll just comment that I think you're right to point that out.
Yeah.
But I think that what we're talking about is that we're just talking about sort of underlining the importance of having your raw data kept really clear and really well defined, so that if someone else, say someone at another ONG, says like, I'm really interested in the data that you collected from this like town or village and on this population, could you share your data with me so that I can do some analysis on it? The person should be able to like understand and use the data without asking you too many questions. So I guess that depends upon how you've coded the data, but also if you have a data dictionary, say with income, and I guess it would just depend upon how you decided to separate it, right? And then in terms of the interconnectedness of the multiple factors, I feel like that has more to do with like the analysis, the statistics, or the the qualitative analysis versus the raw data. So of course there's going to be interconnectedness, But I think that we're kind of more underlining the original data itself, kind of protecting that so that if someone else wants to analyze that, they're able to use it in a way that the data itself is still, I don't know what the word is that I'm looking for,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it's still has it's like integrity, and that it's just the data that you collected. Yeah, and of course, you know, de-identification of data and data privacy and all that is a totally different issue that we're not touching upon. We're just more talking about the preservation of the data. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but Jennifer, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of touched on what I was getting at. Is this is like the question we had earlier, where you're trying to pull in quantitative and qualitative data together, and yeah, like do some analysis on which of these factors affect what thing. That's where it gets really tricky. And so yeah, that's the analysis side of it, which I think Renee kind of touched on. And we're thinking more about organizing. You know, if you've got a spreadsheet tracking, you know, here's a bunch of people that we talked to, yeah, in this village, and here's perhaps their income, and, you know, whether or not they have access to healthcare or certain, you know, different factors. You know, thinking about that survey data, you know, or, you know, your interview transcript, something like that. That's where we're looking at, and then getting into that second step of, yeah, the analysis, or trying to make connections between those different pieces of data, is kind of where, yeah, I think where you were going with your question. I will say, if for some reason, you know, if you're doing these kinds of things, the best practice too, if you're working, say, putting your data into a spreadsheet from your research, making sure that each individual column, kind of like we said, is one of those variables. So income would be in one column, you know, healthcare access would be in another column, things like that. And so even though they might be connected and you can import them and do some analysis, you know, yeah, like somebody earlier mentioned a relational database or something, they can be analyzed together, but keeping all those individual data points separate is going to make that easier on you, because Excel's not going to understand that, you know, your income might be $20,000. No, you don't have healthcare. But if you've got two different pieces of data in Excel in the same section, it's not going to understand it when you're importing it to something else. So yeah, there's kind of two different ways to look at it. These, the analysis side, and then there's just the raw data side. So I hope that helped.
Yes, I think yes, true. Both question is actually interconnected, and that very rightly you have put this answer in a very proper manner. And I'm very happy to be part of this. So
Good.
yes, thank you.
Good.
Yes.
I'm glad that helped. Okay, so I see let's keep moving on. So another thing to think about, you know, again, talking about maybe, you know, human subjects data, if you're doing any kind of health research or any personally identifiable information, anything that might fall under HIPAA, which is in the US, the health insurance privacy regulations. Or if you're working with, say, a commercial funder or on some kind of patent related data, making sure all these things are kept secure, protected from damage, they comply with any regulations that are out there. This is also the kinds of things that funders are going to want to know. Yep, I see Renee through in the chat. FERPA educational data, if you're working with students or other education data. We mentioned before, you know, making sure things are password protected, laptops are, you know, password protected. If you happen to be working with this health data, there are regulations about that in terms of making sure that it's encrypted at all points. They don't want you putting it into a cloud storage like a Dropbox. And they want to make sure that it's encrypted. If you're sending it to somebody else, you're using a secure encryption tool to make sure that data doesn't get caught somewhere and stolen in the middle. I think USB drives are going away, but even, you know, your hard drive, your laptop, you know, if you forget it on an airplane or somebody snags your hard drive, it's possible that your data can be stolen. Every once in a while, you hear about somebody's laptop getting stolen or left behind, and some data being at risk. And so this is where your backups and things like that come into play to make sure that your data is safe, and encrypted, or whatever format is the best for what you're working with. You know, again, everybody likes to use cloud storage now. It's especially convenient if you're working with others on your project, especially if you're working with people from other institutions. For example, you know, if I'm at UConn and I'm working with somebody from Harvard, you know, our individual campuses have their own restrictions for what you can access. But if you've got something off in the cloud, you both should be able to get to it. Important thing about cloud storage is make sure in the, you know, the policies, if there's anything about whether or not they own any access or who has access to what parts of your data, and having another backup. Don't throw everything into Google Drive and just, you know, hope it stays there safely, making sure there's another backup as well. And again, you know, check the privacy expectations. If you're working with that protected or confidential data that I mentioned, making sure that that kind of stuff is not going into the cloud, because you just can't guarantee how safe it's going to be. And we're going to touch on data repositories in a moment. And those are some other options for how to make sure that your data is stored securely. So just because you've got something stored somewhere does not mean that it's safely preserved for the long term. You know, the stuff that's in my Google Drive, some of it's been there for quite a long time, but that doesn't mean that, you know, Google Drive isn't going to disband tomorrow and all of our stuff is gone for the long term. And so there are ways that you can make sure that all of your data is stored safely and that it's preserved for the long term. It's going to prevent you from using some kind of old software or old device that maybe no longer is working and you can't get to the data. Well, I see we're running close to on time. So I want to just skip over this. This kind of touches on what Renee mentioned earlier in terms of making sure that things are in an open data format, so that, you know, if for some reason Microsoft products suddenly cease to exist, you can still read a spreadsheet or a Word document in another type of software. A CSV can be opened by many kinds of software. And so that makes it accessible to anyone. Again, keeping your master files in an open format. So you've got your raw data saved somewhere safely, read only, and it's in the most open format as possible. So you've got your spreadsheet that is read only in a CSV format, so that if you need to get to it in the future, you should hopefully have no problem with that. Couple of things to think about as you're preserving your data. If you're encrypting or compressing it, it can cause some data loss or corruption. I think tools are hopefully getting better about this, but I know, for example, image files, if you're encrypting or compressing them, it can degrade the image quality. And so that's why, like the TIFF or PNG files that we mentioned, those I think have the least amount of, say, you know, degradation, or not necessarily corruption, but the images will degrade over time if you're working, say, with just a JPEG. So depending on what you're working with, it might be good to read up about any kinds of risks for the sorts of files that you're working with. And just quickly, we mentioned this maybe with patent or commercial data, but you can't assume that just because you're doing the research that you have lifetime access to own that data. So depending on your funder, they might have a policy about, you know, the data actually belongs to the commercial company that you're doing research for. Or, for example, if I'm doing research here at UConn and I go to work at another institution, I can't necessarily take that with me, because UConn says any work done while you're employed by them stays with them. And so those are other important things to think about. You know, if you want to take your work and work on it at a different institution or under a different funder, it's important to know about that. So we mentioned checking about repository requirements. The best thing to do is to try to share like data with like data. So if you know that there are other researchers out there doing similar work, there's probably some place that you're all sharing your data together, a certain repository, other location that will allow you to find other data sets to work with. And it also will comply with the funder requirements, making sure that you've got your data shared somewhere that others can find it. So thinking about these repositories, there's a couple different kinds. So your institution may have a repository where researchers from that place can put their data. There is discipline-specific repositories out there. So again, it might be just for the kinds of research that you're doing. You know, in the sciences, we like to give some examples. There are really specific databases out there for the different types of maybe organisms that people are working on, different fish, different other creatures, different specific type of research. And then there's what we call cross-disciplinary or general repositories. And I'll show you an example of those in just a moment. The other aspect of that, again, we're coming to lots of different aspects of the same thing, is that not all of them necessarily preserve or make data accessible. There are different things. It's, you know, like a Venn diagram, like it shows here. Just because something is stored there doesn't mean the public can access it unless it's set up to do that. And just because maybe it's stored there and accessible, you want to make sure that that repository has protocols for backup and preservation for the long term, so that it's long-term available. You know, even if I put something in the institutional repository, maybe they may not have those backup protocols for long-term. I see a couple of folks are having to leave. Yeah, we are going to be putting this on YouTube, as Sarah said, so we'll finish up and you can view the end of it later on. Yep, I see Renee threw in the chat, Re3 data, which is a great way to find a repository that is applicable to your discipline. There's a link on here to those NIH data sharing resources that they support. Some open repositories. Yeah, we like OSF, we like Figshare. Yep, Zenodo is based out of the EU. Here's an example quickly of what OSF looks like. This is for an online course that I did in 2020. And you can see I have different file types down here. I've got some recordings, some PowerPoints, a PDF of a poster. The nice thing about OSF is that it's kind of cut off up top here, but you can make your project private until you're ready to share it. And this is another great one where you can work with others from multiple institutions because it's not bound, say, to where I'm working. I could work with somebody from a different institution and we can both have access to this. So that's really useful. If you happen to be doing any data analysis or creating code to analyze your things, excuse me, there are journals or websites that allow you to publish the code for, you know, here's a new way that I thought to analyze this type of thing. We definitely recommend that you sign up for an ORCID ID. It's a personal link that identifies you as the researcher who has done your work. It prevents name disambiguation. So for folks who maybe have some, you know, all the John Smiths in the world, it's going to identify which one you are and which research is linked to you. Kind of like a LinkedIn for research, sort of. You can link your publications, places that you've worked, things like that. Making sure that you get DOIs for any research that you've uploaded. A lot of repositories will do that. The OSF example that I showed you before allows you to get a DOI for your research set that you put up there. And I think we're going to leave it there. So we have time for a couple more questions if there are any. I'm going to stop sharing. I know we ran through a lot there at the end, but we do have time for a couple more questions if anyone has any. If not, as Sarah noted, this is going to go up on YouTube. And for those that signed up today, we'll get you a copy of the slides so you have access to all those links.
Yeah, we still have 2 minutes so we can.
We have
see
2 minutes.
when people are leaving.
And if anybody has a question that would be easier for them to discuss rather than type, just put your name in the chat and I can unmute you. So that might facilitate your question a little more smoothly too. So we will be sending around the slides that Jennifer and Renee put together, as well as the YouTube recording to everyone who registered. And the YouTube recording will also go up on ISA's YouTube channel. So please feel free to come back and reference the session at any time. I'm not seeing any additional questions, so I just want to thank Jennifer and Renee so much for organizing this. I've been monitoring the feedback in the chat and there have been so many positive comments. So this was really helpful and thank you so
Great.
much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us. All right. Have a great day.
Bye now.